Ghost in the crowd. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Beyond the blind spot. What happened to Brian Shaffer? Vanished without a trace. The Brian Shaffer mystery. A medical student goes into a bar, parties for 2 hours, and then just vanishes into thin air in a packed bar with all of the entrances covered by CCTV. Not a single person or camera catches him leaving, just poof, gone. Brian Shaffer's disappearance has baffled police and the internet for nearly 20 years now, and we're no closer to solving this bizarre vanishing even all these years later. Let's get to know Brian and see if we can unravel this most confusing mystery. Let's get into it. March the 31st, 2006 was a Friday, and everyone at Ohio State University was out celebrating the start of spring break. Brian Shaffer had gone out for a steak dinner with his father, Randy, who reported that Brian looked exhausted. Not surprising, he'd been studying most nights until the morning hours for his end-of-term exams for the past 2 weeks straight. Not that Brian was struggling academically, he'd already completed his undergraduate degree in microbiology and was now 2 years into getting a medical degree on top of that. He also had a long-term relationship with Alexis Wagoner, a fellow medical student, whom he planned to propose to just a week later during a planned and paid-for trip to Miami. They were, by all accounts, a very happy and stable couple. Seriously, Brian had everything going for him. The only blemish on the handsome 27-year-old's life was that his mother had passed away just a month before. This loss was so devastating for him that he told Alexis that she might do better with someone else because she didn't deserve a man going through such a dark patch. And he started making dark jokes about running away with her, leaving university, their friends and family in the dust behind them to start a simpler life somewhere else. So no, Brian wasn't in a good place, but his grades weren't slipping and those around him were truly supportive of his depressive episodes. Being depressed because his mother died is completely understandable. If he was considering self-harm, then Brian was statistically more likely to withdraw or to become secretive. Instead, he was talking about his grief to people who genuinely cared about him. After the dinner, father and son bade each other goodbye, and Brian headed off with a friend, William Florence, for some good old campus bar hopping. They started off at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a popular bar located on North High Street. The plan was to bounce from bar to bar, drink one shooter at each bar until they reached the end of the street, then cross over to the other side of the street and work their way up until they reached the Ugly Tuna again. You know, typical student hijinks to kick off spring break. They met another friend, Meredith Reed, just before their bar hopping was about to end back at the Ugly Tuna. They arrived at 1:15 a.m. and met up with some more friends 45 minutes before the last round was called. The three of them were quite intoxicated, though not enough to render them incapable of standing upright. Now, I need to give you the layout of the Ugly Tuna Saloon because it's here where things go from strange to utterly impossible. The bar is located on the second floor of a larger complex, and the whole building is under surveillance 24 hours a day. On the second floor, there's a camera pointed at the escalator that caught the three of them going up. The second camera is pointed at the door, but at a slightly crooked angle. It records people going in and out of the bar, but the image stops just a few feet from the door, meaning that there's a blind spot between where the camera drops off and the door. The gap is only about 4 to 6 feet long. So for Brian to disappear in a distance that was shorter than he was tall, the likelihood of him entering the bar is almost 100%. The girls and the bouncers would have seen him go in or noticed him veer off. The bar was the only complete structure up there. The only place you could go after going up the escalator is to turn to the right to a service exit that led to a construction zone where a new parking lot was being built. The journey there, for a man that's pretty intoxicated, just wasn't possible. The door is difficult to open on a normal day for a sober individual, and the area beyond it is a minefield of construction material. Anyone walking through there, in the pitch black dark no less, wouldn't get 6 feet in before stumbling over something. With that explained, let's get back to Brian's movements that night. He was inside the bar until 1:55. Multiple witnesses attested to this. Brian then walked out with the two girls that met up with them there as they were heading home, and Brian chatted with them for a few minutes outside the entrance to the bar before they left via the escalator. Brian then turns to go back into the bar, at which point he leaves the frame. Remember, he can only go one of two ways: inside the Ugly Tuna or toward the service exit. There was no shortage of witnesses milling around the entrance, since the majority of the patrons were walking out to leave in time for the place to close at 2. Yet no one recalls seeing Brian inside or at the service exit, except for William, who reported that he did catch sight of Brian after he returned on the other side of the crowd, but he didn't stop to talk to him right then. Now, you can chalk this off to everyone having had too much to drink, but there are perfectly sober bouncers keeping an eye on things out there too, and they would have definitely seen a man struggling with the service door, so it's safe to assume that Brian did make it back inside. 2 a.m. arrived and everyone was ushered out. Meredith and William couldn't locate Brian, so they called him multiple times and even checked the men's bathroom. Witnesses confirmed that the two were indeed searching for their friend, but when the doors closed at 2, there was still no Brian. So they hung around the entrance for a few minutes, still continuing to call his cell phone and hoping that he's one of the last stragglers to emerge from the bar. After 15 minutes, they give up, deciding that Brian must have walked the 6 blocks home to his apartment after all. Annoyed, but not too concerned, they leave in Meredith's car. The next day, Meredith and William went to Brian's apartment to pick up William's car, but they didn't check on him. It was quite early, so they didn't bother waking him just then. But throughout the Saturday and Sunday, Brian never answered his phone. It just kept ringing. Brian's girlfriend, Alexis, and his father both assumed that Brian was just sleeping off a hangover that first day. But when Sunday came around, they both went to his apartment to look for him. But of course, Brian wasn't there. On Monday, when he didn't show up for his flight to Miami, Alexis and Randy Shaffer finally called in to report Brian missing. Police jumped on the case, pooling all of the resources they could into finding Brian. Unfortunately, they had already lost 3 days, so catching up was a logistical nightmare. There was no activity on Brian's phone or credit cards, no movement at his apartment, and the phone was now no longer ringing, presumably because its battery ran out. The Ugly Tuna was searched, as well as the whole building it was located in. So was the entire street, top to bottom, inside trash cans, alleyways, and they even got cadaver dogs out in the surrounding wooded areas and along the nearby river. They pulled the security footage from every bar on that street, and let me tell you, they had no shortage of CCTV to go through. Security was tighter than Fort Knox on the party strip, and most of the bars had cameras pointed at their entrances and towards the sidewalk in front of their establishments. But there was nothing, not a single frame showing Brian. You must understand that this is impossible if Brian left the Ugly Tuna at all. First, he'd have been caught walking toward the escalator and then taking the stairs downward. Not to mention dozens of cameras that should have caught sight of him going either way up or down the street. So that means he never left the building where the Ugly Tuna is located, right? Only the cops located and named every single person on the surveillance footage at the bar. But Brian was not seen leaving the bar at any time, on camera or by other party goers. The Ugly Tuna gave them nothing. The only way to get out of the bar, besides the front door, was a trash chute behind the serving counter. But that chute isn't large enough to accommodate a child, let alone a man that was 6'2". So that brings us back to the service exit, but it was empty too. And the canines didn't pick up that Brian had been there at all, though they certainly smelled him all over the bar. So where on earth was Brian then? Meredith answered all of the police's questions and agreed to a lie detector test, as did the 2 women they'd met there that night that Brian walked out. But William refused the lie detector test and lawyered up the moment the police suggested it. Yes, this was a suspicious move, but William was in his full rights to get a lawyer, and unless he'd done something to Brian in 5 minutes or less, how were police supposed to legally demand more cooperation from him? Months of searching, missing persons posters, and even a few psychics that Randy Shaffer brought in, and still nothing. Alexis developed a habit of calling Brian's phone every few days, hoping for a miracle. And in September, 6 months after his disappearance, Brian's phone rang. It rang 3 times and then went to voicemail, like the person on the other side dropped the call. After that, the phone never came on again. The ping showed that the phone was somewhere in Hilliard, a town 14 miles away. Since then, police and the service provider have stated that this was simply a glitch on the computers, but they never released why they believe that this is the case. Then Brian's apartment, that Randy and Alexis left exactly as it was all this time, was broken into. Unfortunately, this was very likely just an opportunistic robbery and not connected to the case. They'd only stolen electronics and DVDs, all things that could be sold relatively quickly. There were no signs that the house was searched. It all pointed to a quick entrance to grab what they could early so that the thief or thieves could leave as quickly as possible. Cruel hoaxes and wild goose chases after homeless men who vaguely resemble Brian do their rounds every year, but so far, they've all been dead ends and sick pranks. And that's where we are with this. Brian Shaffer is just gone, quite literally vanished into thin air. So, what are the theories? Let's take a look at William first. The only real red flag that we have is his refusal to take a polygraph test, and honestly, I don't blame him. Polygraphs are notorious for being unreliable, and if police didn't have anything concrete on him, he was under no legal obligation to give them any more of his time. And the fact of the matter is, he'd had as much to drink as Brian, so he'd have had to remove a 6-foot-tall man from the building and return in under 5 minutes, while neither of them were all too steady on their feet. No, all indications point to Brian never leaving the building at all, so that theory is out the window. Was Brian in danger of unaliving himself? Not really. He was sad because his mother had just died, yes, but all of the people around him were supportive, and he spoke to them about his feelings often enough. Under the influence of alcohol, those feelings certainly could have been amplified, leading him to do something rash. But again, we stand with the problem of where he was supposed to have gone in just 5 minutes. That building's been searched 6 ways to Sunday. If he'd gotten trapped somewhere, some trace of him would have been found by now. But let's say for a second that Brian wanted to run away and start fresh, and he somehow figured out how to do it while drunk and without being detected. He only had his wallet and phone with him. There's been no activity on his credit cards, his ID hasn't shown up anywhere, and his social security number hasn't been flagged. If he wanted to disappear properly, he would have dumped the phone and the wallet, but that would leave him to start his new life as a vagabond. He certainly didn't have the connections to get his hands on a fake ID, social security, birth certificate, and all the other documentation he'd need to get a flat, a job, medical care, or any of that. His biggest dream was to own his own island one day. That's not the kind of guy who's going to live under a bridge for the rest of his life. Though, I have to admit that might explain the phone. If the phone was inside the building, someone would have heard it ring. It was called hundreds of times throughout Saturday and Sunday, and the Ugly Tuna had scores of cleaners, management, and servers getting ready for opening hours. The music wasn't on during their cleanups. People moved in and out of the building at all hours of the day and night. Someone would have heard it, but if his possessions were dumped, someone could have picked it up, explaining why it rang just 14 miles away, several months after he disappeared. If Brian wanted to run away, he wouldn't have camped out in the next town over without being found. This person could have found the items by accident and probably realized who the wallet and phone belonged to and decided he wanted nothing to do with a case that was as high profile as this. Or it was in the hands of the person who done something to him. It makes sense that the individual or individuals would be in the general vicinity. And that just turns it all right back around. How did they get him out of the building then? William could be lying about seeing Brian in the bar, but that still leaves us with only a 5-minute window to get a drunk giant out of the building and to somehow avoid a gazillion cameras. Are you seeing the problem here? All of the physical evidence, mainly the single eyewitness and the CCTV, indicated that Brian never left the building or the street. But all of the logic leads us to believe that he did leave or was forced to leave, but that he did it without being detected from the only place that he could have possibly left the building from, the escalators. There are just too many buts, what ifs, maybes, and could be's, and not a single one of them has a feasible explanation attached to them. Unless you can come up with a better solution than a rift in the time-space continuum sucked him out of existence, that's where we are right now. If we can figure out how Brian left the building, well, I have a feeling that will change the entire course of the investigation. The answer lies not in the why, where he is, or even what happened to him. It's all about the how. That's going to be the smoking gun right there.